It really is fantastic to be in this room and with so many people that I have known for a very long time and in different bits of my life, and many of you are in different organizations which I get to have some connection with. But I particularly want to speak about my real affection for Clean Break and my love of it. I got to be involved in this 36 years ago. I'm not going to tell you just how old I am, but I am very, very old. And at that time, I was a young lawyer, and the reason why Clean Break got in touch with me was because I was doing so much work. I mean, in fact, somebody introduced me not that long ago as the Helena Kennedy, the lawyer who represents women and other criminals. So we're all criminals. Anyway, but I remember either Jackie or Jenny Hicks, I can't remember whether it was Jackie Hillsborough or Jenny Hicks, but one of them got in touch with me because she'd read something that I'd written in the Guardian or somewhere about the fact that women should not be in prison. The vast majority of women just shouldn't be there. And I at that stage, you've got to remember that I qualified in the early 70s. And I became involved in the women's movement. I was a young woman from a working class background, which was a rare thing as a barrister at that time. And I had gone into the law because I wanted to act for people, you know, who I didn't feel were fairly represented in the courts. And sure enough, the first time I ever went to court, it was to Tottenham Magistrates Court. I acted for a woman who had a suspended sentence, and sure enough, the magistrates said, well, she's breached a suspended sentence and we're sending her to jail. And I'd like it to be a good story where I could say I triumphed, my advocacy was so good, but it's not true. She was sent to jail. And I remember going down to the cells afterwards, and I was gutted that this woman was going to prison, and I kept thinking maybe if somebody more experienced had done this case, she wouldn't be going there. But the thing that she was concerned about, and she said to me, can you phone my best friend so that she can pick up my kids from the nursery and the school and make sure that they don't go into care? Can you phone my brother because he might be able to pay for my flat so that I don't lose it, my council house? The whole horror of the impact that this was going to have on her life. And I went back to Chambers on the bus, and I thought to myself, maybe I'm not cut out for this, because I thought, why are they sending women to prison who are, I mean, she was poor. The guy who was the father of her kids had pissed off. She had stolen food on some occasion from Marks and Spencer's, and then she had broken this. She had given some sort of, and she had on a whole set of occasions thieved, but none of it was gross. None of it was huge amounts of money that were involved, and I'm sure that none of it was felt very much by Marks and Spencer's, but there she was being sent off to prison at huge expense, her children at risk of being taken into care and losing the one place that she had to live in, and the terror of all of that. It was so sickening that it confirmed everything that I felt about law's failure. And as I went on in my practice over the 70s, into the late 70s and into the 80s, it became clear to me that one had to look at what law was about. And that's what I wanted to talk to you about today, is that law is the product of power. And we have to understand that societies make rules and always have done, and they do it on the basis of, you know, who has power gets to set the rules. And, you know, women were not in the law. They were not in the judiciary. They were not usually in the parliaments that made statutory law. And so the whole business of how law was made did not include the perspective or experiences of women, and women, of course, were people without very much power in society. And so the very nature of law meant that it was not going to serve women well in the first place. And I had a very strong sense in relation to class, but what I grew to understand in the years that followed was that whole conflation, and we didn't use the word intersectionality then, but if you look at the very first book that I wrote about this, I'm very clear about the ways in which, you know, it was bad if you were a white woman. If you were a white working class woman, it was terrible. If you were a black woman, then add that into the mix of being a woman, and if you were a woman who was gay, then of course you're another feature in this whole way in which layers of discrimination and stereotyping and assumptions about the life you must be leading were being made. And if you were in some way an inappropriate woman, you got a harder deal in the courtrooms. And that became a subject on which I wrote, on which I broadcast, where anytime I could, I would be on Women's Hour talking about the ways in which the system was failing women. And I remember when eventually I took Silk in 1990, and at that time I was working on a book, and I was at 1991, and when the book came out in 92, called Eve Was Framed, it was an analysis, and it was basically the product of my experience in the courts acting for women. And I didn't act for women exclusively. I did lots of big terrorist trials and other homicides and all kinds of things. And but the thing that I was writing about was law's failure. And it was much easier for me to write about it once I was a Queen's Counsel, because it became difficult to say, well, she's just some bloody woman that's got a grouse to make with the legal system. But even then, it was quite interesting just how the Eve Was Framed did rock establishment thinking in the law. I was on loads of panels with judges and old judges saying there's no discrimination against women. We don't even notice whether it's a man or woman in front of us. No, we're blind to difference. And there was a terrible judge at the Old Bailey called, well, I shouldn't be naming him. Anyway, it was there were many terrible judges at the Old Bailey. But I remember this one. I do remember having a client who came up shaking into the dock and was asked, how do you plead? And he said, not guilty. And the judge said, not what? And he said, guilty. And he said, that's more like it. And that was the kind of feeling you got in the court, that you were supposed to be pleading guilty and getting on with it. And he did a television program with me when Eve Was Framed came out, and he was absolutely insisting that women were treated with not just the same treatment that any man would get, but that women were also treated with additional clemency and with a great deal of special pleading because it was women, and of course, there were circumstances where women sometimes did better, but it was usually where they were conforming to the stereotype that the judge held of women. Were they good mothers? Were they good wives? Were they, did they have clean children? Did the report say that they were living the perfect existence of a certain kind of woman? And it's that business of how assumptions about womanhood and the female entered into the system and contaminated the way in which decision-making was being made. And so then we started looking at the black letter law and the way that the actual legal thing itself, things like provocation, did not work for women. And I was doing lots of homicide cases and acting for women who killed their husbands after years of being abused. And often the defences were just not available to them. Only recently, I was on the tube and a woman was looking at me and I could feel her eyes, and I turned around and she said to me, "Are you who I think you are?" And I said, "Well, if you're thinking of killing your husband, I'm your woman." Let me tell you, there were a few women on that train who thought, if I'd had my cards, I would have distributed them. Anyway, but it really was about law failing women, because it was constructed without having women's experience included in there. So I just love the idea of how about this being about unmuting the voices of women, because I brought Eve Was Framed up to date in 2004, sort of about a little bit more than 10 years after the first edition. And I brought it up to date at that time because different shifts and changes were taking place, but not enough, and about where there were still problems. And the business of women and prison is still, to this day, after 50 years of practicing at the bar, we've still got this incredible issue of how women in prison almost invariably have been the victims of crime, have suffered often abusive relationships as children, as adults, the ways in which they have been at the serious end of violence, and also the understanding of what brought women into this circumstance. And I then, a few years ago, 2018, I wrote a new book and I called it Eve Was Shamed, which has now gone out in paperback as Miss Justice. And the reason for my writing it again, and it's a completely different book, this one, was because I couldn't believe that so much time had passed, so much knowledge had been accumulated, and yet still we were in the situation where we had to have the Me Too movement, where we had to have women be able to find a way in which they could have their voices heard using technology and using social media and describing what they had experienced. And it was about the way in which we continue to shame women and to silence women's voices, because women who complained about Jimmy Savile, young women who complained about the things that happened to them in northern cities at the hands of men, women complained about all of this stuff, but they were never listened to. And so it's about the listening to the voices of women, and that's why this whole period of researching and this work that's been done by Laura, this wonderful art exhibition, is so important, because it is about really hearing what women have experienced and listening to their voices. I love the fact that this conversation about the human home, that yes, there are issues about finding accommodation and so on for women so they can live decent lives, but home, of course, is about something more. Home is not a place, but it's about a feeling. And so many of the women have ever been deprived of that sense of a place that is theirs, of feeling that they are valuable and of worth, and the confidence that has been driven out of them, which they probably did have at some early stage of their childhood. So, I mean, I learned when I think it was Jenny Hicks who contacted me, but when I went for the first time 36 years ago to the Muse off Camden High Street and met the women who were working at Clean Break, and met women who'd just come out of prison or had been there coming for some years by that time, who were actually writing plays themselves. It was just a whole wonderful new world in which we could start looking at this issue and getting the knowledge of it out there. And I thought it was going to be the way in which we could have policy changed. Well, not enough policy has changed. And what we have to be saying is that the majority of prisons are unnecessary places, and that we have to be closing them down. We have to be creating other ways in which women can actually have the support and opportunity to develop their skills and so on, instead of sending people to prison. But alternatives to prison are going to be thin on the ground when you've got a probation service that has been destroyed. Chris Grayling, the guy who put his hand up at the cabinet meetings and said, "Oh, austerity, I'll take," he was the justice minister, "I'll take a 40% cut. Everybody else 25%. I'll beat that. I'll take 40%. And part of it was to destroy legal aid, to destroy the probation service, to basically completely undermine any alternatives to prison and the things that we really need to see happening. So the question, of course, that is being asked in this project, and the research project is fantastic, is what are we going to do? What are you going to do with your voice? And there are some in this room who have strong voices, and we have to make everybody's voice add together to have a sort of clamour for some way of addressing the scandal of what we do to women, putting them into prison when prison is really not the place that women should be sent to. And we know that the majority of women going to prison have not committed serious crime. We know that the loss that they experience as a result is absolutely huge in their lives, leaving a hole in their hearts of the injustice of it. And so I really feel that a moment has come where we're going to have to call out what's been going on. And, the first thing you have to do is, they always say about, the claim about democracy is you can kick the rascals out. Well, I hope that we do kick this crowd of rascals out and very soon. But the big challenge to us will be to actually have our voices heard in saying something has to be done about the prison system. And it has to be particularly done around women's incarceration and the ways in which that has accelerated in recent years, whole multiplying of the number of people put into prison and so on. Why is art an important thing in all of this? Well, one of the things is that for me, the arts are one of the ways in which I too deal with pain. And I had never understood it before. But when you're doing the sort of work that a criminal lawyer does, defending, and you spend time with clients who really have suffered, that's where I learned about human rights. You learn your human rights from your clients. You learn your human rights from the people you sit in the cells with. You learn about human rights from the people who tell you their stories and tell you what's happened in their lives. And so knowing that stuff, there has to be ways in which you deal with it. And of course, there's no doubt that not only can the arts give expression to those stories and be told to a much wider public, but also gives a way of somehow exercising some of that stuff. And so I just feel that the theatre is one of the ways in which we, through empathy, we learn about each other, and we find ways of reckoning with it. As I felt the other night, I mean, when the week or so ago, as Anna was saying, watching the play Dixon and Daughters, about the ways in which abuse and abuse in a family can have such poisonous effects on everybody, and that sometimes it goes unspoken, and those secrets live and are so destructive inside our societies, our communities, and inside our families and homes. The businesses that we have to address is the stigmatization that comes with going before the courts of being convicted of something, but the way in which it's internalized by women as somehow failing as a woman, failing as a mother, failing as a daughter, failing in all these ways that we feel that we fail. And so I just think that the way in which the arts provides us with avenues for addressing some of those things, the ways in which we've seen how Laura's work, her artwork, tells a story about how, I mean, it's about stepping into the frame as you were describing, but tells us about other lives and how they've been blighted by some of the institutional ways in which we deal with people's pain. So I am privileged to be a patron of Clean Break. I love the fact that this work is going on in this research project. I don't think we've analysed enough the impact that the arts and that creativity and theatre, the role that it can play. And I think that we have to find ways in which we can make sure that there's proper financial support for this going forward. But we also have to make the argument, yet again, but louder, with everybody's voice being heard, that prison is not the answer. It really is not the answer. Now, I not very long ago, Scotland came up with I practice law down here, so I don't practice in Scotland, but every so often they invite me up to do something as somebody who's sort of got 1 foot in, 1 foot out. And so I was up there looking at a project that they have, and I think it was scuppered by COVID for a while, but which was that they were going to have only one real prison, which would deal with, very serious crime, where nothing but prison would satisfy the sort of demands of a society. But it was only going to be for 70 prisoners. It would have a space for 70 prisoners, because it was worked out that was really as many as there were who committed really serious crime, and that there would be houses all around the country which were big enough to have a group of women would live in them. They would have their own room, but they would also be able to go out during the day and go to training projects, go to therapy, have health problems dealt with, deal with addiction problems and so on, and also be able to have their children come and visit and stay with them. And it just seemed to me that, I don't know where that's got to, but that has to be the answer to all of this. And because there is no doubt that women who end up before the courts very often have been at the receiving end of terrible things for which they are going to need support and help of a real kind. But that involves resource. And at the moment, I suspect that whoever is in government after another election, there ain't going to be a lot of money around. But our voices have to say, what are your priorities in a society that is decent, that really does value our common humanity, that does genuinely talk about human rights? and the way in which human rights means each and every one of us. And how do we recognize the humanity in all of us? And so, I mean, that kind of conversation is the conversation that we have to insist upon and have our voices heard in. Thank you.